The sense of being a separate, egoic self begins with the astral, not with the physical body. The soul is individualized spirit. Paramahansa Yogananda, author, spiritual teacher. Young adulthood experiences. Chakras. Around about the age of 15 or 16, I began taking an interest in yoga and meditation. In my 10th grade history class, we took a trip to a Hindu temple somewhere in London, and there was a gift shop at the end of the tour where I purchased a book on yoga. I didn't even think I knew why I was buying the book. I just felt called to buy it, and I trusted that feeling. One of the most important things I learned from that book was the concept of chakras. I began paying close attention to the parts of my body where they reside to see if there was any truth to this. Shortly thereafter, I noticed that I could physically feel them when they became active. I learned that I could manually activate them simply by focusing on them for a short time. Chakras have been a very real phenomena for me ever since, and have been one of the most important things I've discovered along my spiritual journey. Another key thing I learned from that book was the Shavasana pose. The way the book instructed one to perform the Shavasana pose was to lie down on your back, palms facing upwards, while slowly stretching every single muscle in the body, the tongue, the eyeballs, everything, and then release it all simultaneously as slowly as possible. Then, the idea is to lie there and just be spiritually open to whatever comes. This is typically done after a full yoga routine, but I took this simple technique and practiced it in this way every night while lying in bed from the age of 16 to present day. Doing this led me to experimenting with altered states of consciousness, particularly in bed at night when it was most convenient to do so. As time went on, I began hearing voices in my head again, similar to the angelic ones I'd heard as a child, but not the same. It was as though I stumbled upon a way to induce a connection, albeit a faint one, with other forms of intelligence. I usually hear a woman or a man or angelic-sounding voices of varying ages speaking in short, simple phrases, or just one word that pops out. Sometimes the voices are not in English and I can't understand them. I've heard these voices many times before whilst in a hypnagogic state. I've even gone so far as to attempt to initiate communication with them, but with little success. One thing I've observed is that it has something to do with the small energy centers, aka chakras, located in the temples on both sides of the head. These chakras seem to be linked somehow to the third eye and the crown chakra, and when all of these are active together, it opens a kind of portal or a channel for these voices to come through audibly. These temple chakras are historically known to be associated with sonic or sound-related psychic phenomena. I have often responded to the voices, but it's difficult to understand what they're trying to communicate. I honestly do not know if they are spirits, spirit guides, ETs, angels, people who've passed on, all of the above or none of the above. I'd love to ask them if I had the wherewithal to do so, but in this state of consciousness, it's very difficult to prioritize questions based on what would be important information to my awake self. When consciousness is altered, so are its priorities. On the rare occasion that I have the clarity of mind, I'll ask them questions and usually receive coherent answers. Sometimes their answers make no sense, and other times they do. Sometimes I don't like the answers they give me. They are often so spot on that it cuts right through all the layers of my psyche like butter, straight to the harsh truth. This tells me that they're either omniscient or their plane of existence gives them a much higher vantage point from which to see the things that we are blind to from our corporeal perspective. I imagine that what's happening here is a very basic and perhaps underdeveloped form of channeling. Yet another phenomena that has helped me to find some of the answers I've sought after. Channeling. I was about 19 years old when I made the decision to transfer schools from MTSU, Middle Tennessee State University, where I had planned to study audio recording and music business, to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, to get back to my roots and major in the arts instead. On my way to New York, I spent a couple of days with my aunt and uncle who lived just outside of Nashville. They had been very supportive of my journey, and because they lived near MTSU, I had developed a closer relationship with them. Visiting with them was a little send-off before I embarked on a new chapter in my life. My aunt and I used to stay up late, either watching TV or sitting on the porch talking about God knows what, always with a few glasses of bourbon or some such poison. We're both creative types who struggle with depression, so we always had a lot to talk about. What fascinated me most as a child when my family used to visit them was how open they were about the paranormal and sharing family experiences with the unknown, aliens, poltergeists, and other related phenomena. Their house was filled with books on UFOs, channeling, ghosts, etc. My sister Victoria and I loved looking at these books as young children. We were both powerfully drawn to them. No doubt we wished our parents had had books like this. So it had been a common type of conversation when visiting them. Have you seen any UFOs? Are aliens real? Have you seen a ghost? We would drill them with questions for as long as they would tolerate it, eager for the answers to our deepest curiosities. They were some of the only adults we knew who would even take our questions about these things seriously, and this was very important to us. We were like operatives trying to extract information, but with a child's level of intelligence. So, during this short visit, my aunt and I were up late doing our usual thing, and she mentioned something about being a channeler. I didn't know much about channeling, but she explained that it was the process of allowing another being to speak through her. I knew a little about Edgar Cayce and how he used to let his guardian angels speak through him, but I'd never read any of his books. That was about all I had to go on in terms of understanding what she was talking about. She could tell that I was fascinated by this and offered to channel for me that night. I asked, "How would that work?" She told me that she would channel her Pleiadian contact, who went by the name Pludius, and that once he was present, I could ask him anything I wanted to know about the universe, and he would answer me. I was absolutely elated at that point and couldn't wait to get started. I'm sure I played it cool, but this was exactly the kind of thing I'd been waiting for. We sat out on her front porch under the stars. It was spectacularly clear and very warm, the perfect conditions for this type of experience, I thought. She told me she would need a few moments to prepare, to get into the right space within herself to create the ideal conditions for Pludius to come through. This took about 5 minutes, and I remember being quite surprised that it didn't take longer. As soon as Pludius took hold of her, I believe his first words were something like, "Hello, Charles. We have been waiting to hear from you. We would have preferred that you had contacted us well before now." I was taken aback not only by how real the sense was that I was speaking to somebody else, other than my aunt, but also by the fact that they were essentially expressing disappointment that I hadn't reached out before now. I thought, geez, I only just learned about channeling and Pleiadians today. What did they expect? I pushed this to the back of my mind in order to proceed with further questions, now that I had gotten the hang of how this worked. Sadly, though, I don't remember much about what was said, and I wasn't at all diligent about writing things down back then. I recall asking a number of questions that were deeply personal to me at the time, but which have no relevance now. The things that were important to me at the age of 19 were hardly worth sharing. If only I could ask Pludius questions now, I could be so much more inquisitive and thoughtful about my questions. But that is highly unlikely at this point. She has since stopped channeling Pludius. She once told me that she used to wake up in the middle of the night and she'd have to write pages and pages of channeled material, which became very destructive to her ability to sleep and function in the real world. With the experiences I'm having lately, I can understand what that must have been like for her. The only other thing that Pludius said to me which resonated profoundly was, "You are a child of the light." He kept repeating this throughout the session. Just remember, you are a child of the light. As though I had some idea of what this meant. Little did I know he was planting a seed with this statement. I should have asked what it meant, and maybe I did, but I just don't remember his answer. All I know is that I was left feeling puzzled about the whole thing. There was an underlying sense that I had some unspoken responsibility to report back to the Pleiadians about my experiences on Earth. Except I had no idea how to do this, nor did I know what I was supposed to be reporting. One thing was for certain. This whole channeling experience refreshed my internal reserve of questions, giving me new answers to seek and something to look forward to. After the session ended, I asked my aunt, "What did Pludius mean by saying I'm a child of the light?" She said something like, "Sometimes the things he says don't make sense right away, but as time goes by, it will become clearer." She was right. Starseeds, wanderers, volunteers, etc. By the time I reached Brooklyn and settled into my new school, a very important resource was just becoming available to humankind: YouTube. For the first time, we were able to stream interviews, homemade documentaries, amateur videos of all kinds, and more. The barrier between what the mainstream media and the entertainment industry chose to broadcast and the plethora of other things happening in the world was about to be shattered. A greater connection to experiencers of UFOs and other strange phenomena from all over the world was now coming online, and all of us aliens could now discover countless testimonies of others like us and feel less alone in the universe, despite the snail's pace of progress the mainstream so contently plodded along at. This exposed me to countless new facets of ufology, particularly the troves of videos by people who had not only filmed UFOs, but shared their personal stories of contact with ET races and the teachings they had received from them. At the time, access to content like this was virtually non-existent, other than in obscure old books and coast-to-coast AM. Admittedly, there were plenty of hoaxers, misinformers, and attention-seeking charlatans cluttering up the algorithms with their garbage. There always are, and there always will be. But if one possessed a keen enough level of discernment, this was like the California gold rush for UFO experiencers. So many fresh perspectives and ideas to explore. I became like a sponge, absorbing everything I could find on aliens, UFOs, and other tangentially related topics, from the U.S. government's cover-up and denial of the Roswell incident to the ancient astronaut theory. I was certifiably obsessed. I was convinced that this enigma of how the world really works that persisted in evading me was actually solvable, and I felt like I was on the cusp of putting all the pieces together. I stayed up nights and weekends studying this information, as if I were doing a triple major in aliens, archaeology, and conspiracy theories. What began as an innocent effort to seek answers to the strange experiences of my life metamorphosed into a proverbial corkboard of strings and photographs as a new lens through which to view the world, and further refine my ego identity. I became obsessed with conspiracy theories, exploring the alternative explanation of every current and historical event. This research warped my perception of reality in a very unhealthy way. I wandered down this rabbit hole judging the sheeple for blindly believing the mainstream version of reality, without realizing that my new, alternative view was just as dogmatic and narrow-minded. Eventually, I had to draw the line somewhere. It's exhausting, alienating, and downright miserable, living your life believing that everyone's a reptilian shapeshifter working with the Illuminati to secretly enslave humanity and take over the world. I would know. Yet, looking back, this was an integral part of my journey. Not a destination, but a necessary stop along the way to the more balanced place I find myself now. While most days consisted of listening to hours-long whistleblower testimonies from alleged contractors of secret government projects or ex-Majestic 12 members, I would occasionally change my approach and delve into more spiritually related topics. One time in particular, I sat down at my laptop and suddenly remembered that I'd been meaning to search for more information on what Pludius had said to me about being a child of the light. I searched for the phrase on YouTube and found a video entitled something like, "Are you a starseed?" This wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it piqued my interest, and I also suppose it sounded somewhat relevant to my search, so I clicked on it. It was not high in production value and resembled something akin to a PowerPoint presentation, just words appearing in the center of the screen. Have you always felt different? Have you always felt a longing and a connection to the stars? Have you always felt like you didn't belong here on Earth? Do you feel homesick for people and places you can't remember? I answered each question in my mind with an emphatic yes, tears running down my face, and the sensation of all the hairs on the back of my neck stiffening rushed over me as I felt deep within my being. Yes, this explains it. This is me. I am a starseed. I remember I immediately hated the word starseed. I thought it sounded horribly cheesy and stupid. This was not an attribute I was excited to add onto my character. I was an artist and a musician. That was my identity. Starseed just sounded dumb, but I couldn't ignore what the word meant and how connected it made me feel to a deeper part of myself. It rang true in a way that nothing ever had before. After that day, I did not go around my college campus telling everyone, I'm a starseed. In fact, I made a sort of unspoken pact with myself that I would keep this facet of my personality a secret. I already felt weird around people and had trouble with relationships and social interaction. I thought it best for my survival to keep this to myself. As I did more research, the definition of a starseed, for me, evolved into something more like an individual who possesses a vivid or vague recollection of having had previous incarnations as something other than human, on another planet and or in another dimension. This is what resonated with me, and still does to a large extent. But as the years went by, I struggled with identifying too strongly with this label. I couldn't deny that it was just another level of ego, aka spiritual ego, a way to further distinguish myself from others and feel special. I never liked the idea that I was anyone special, but I couldn't deny how much this concept so accurately described how I'd always felt inside. As my spiritual path expanded, so did my view on what this starseed thing really meant. And there are many perspectives on what a starseed is, based on varying levels of understanding. But in my view, this is the most accurate. A starseed is someone who knows that they are a multidimensional being and that there is more to life than we see here on Earth. A multidimensional being is someone who knows that they are made up of more than just mind and body. Some people come in with this knowing, the seed of remembering within them already active. Others awaken to it. Rebecca Campbell, Letters to a Starseed. This new paradigm under which I could now see myself propelled me to seek out more information and more explanation about it. I wanted to know everything, because a big part of me still wasn't satisfied. I was yet again filled with so many new questions to seek answers to. Since that day nearly 16 years ago, I've had some time to delve deeply into this subject, and I've imbibed a wealth of data on this topic. The concept of starseeds was much more pervasive in recent history than I previously understood. Sometime after the 1960s, there was somewhat of a boom of related material spawning from channelers in the United States. Whether this was happening in other parts of the world is something I'm unaware of, but I would suspect that it was. The main sources that I've come across in my findings, which mention starseeds and/or similar concepts, to name a few, are as follows. Brad and Francie Steger's Star People, 1981, from which the term starseed presumably originates. Jim McCarty, Carla Ruckert, and Don Elkins' The Law of One, Book 1 through 5, 1981, which mentions wanderers and brothers and sisters of sorrow. Lee Carroll, aka Cryon, around 1989, who mentions indigo children and old souls. Barbara Marciniak's Bringers of the Dawn, 1992, which mentions members of the family of light. Michel Desmarquet, Tia Uba Prophecy, The Golden Planet, 1993, which mentions the Sukus. Dolores Cannon's The New Earth, 2011, which mentions the 3 waves of volunteers. Most other sources that I've come across seem to reference these books as a jumping-off point for their content, and do not provide much else in terms of insight into the lore and myth of these beings, as far as I'm aware. Interestingly enough, all of the above sources are essentially from ETs, and therefore the concept of starseeds has been introduced into the human experience by the ETs themselves. All of these sources occurred at different times in different locations and roughly a decade apart. It is relatively safe to assume they were unaware of each other and were not channeling the same source. Whether or not one finds the process of channeling to be a trustworthy source of information is highly subjective. But regardless, it is unusual, to say the least, that so many people would channel such similar concepts unbeknownst to each other. I suppose one could argue that each subsequent channeler simply read The Star People or The Law of One and made their own version, but I personally do not believe that. The cadence of each spiritual entity is vastly different, and their messages, while similar, are from very different perspectives. In The Law of One, Ra describes wanderers quite differently from the generally accepted definition of what starseeds are. Questioner: Thank you. Well, you spoke of wanderers. Who are wanderers? Where do they come from? Ra: I am Ra. Imagine, if you will, the sands of your shores. As countless as the grains of sand are the sources of intelligent infinity. When a social memory complex has achieved its complete understanding of its desire, it may conclude that its desire is service to others, with the distortion towards reaching their hand, figuratively, to any entities who call for aid. These entities, whom you may call the brothers and sisters of sorrow, move towards this calling of sorrow. These entities are from all reaches of the infinite creation, and are bound together by the desire to serve in this distortion. Ra, via Carla Ruckert, The Law of One, Book 1, The Raw Material. Session 12, 12.26, January 28th, 1981. From Ra's perspective, it would seem that their view of wanderers is more akin to the Buddhist concept of the bodhisattva. This is not to say that as someone who identifies as a wanderer, I think I'm some sort of enlightened being, but I think it illustrates that this concept, however nuanced, has been around for centuries. Perhaps human beings have always felt a sense that there are others on this planet, blending in, living alongside them. It's certainly a strange feeling to think that I may be on the other side of that. I personally have come to identify far more with the idea of the wanderer rather than a traditional starseed. This distinction is important to me because of the culture that has evolved out of these ideas and how people in these communities speak about themselves. It is common for a starseed to identify with a particular planet, ET civilization, or star system. They will be born with a longing sense of attachment to a particular civilization which they've carried with them into their present incarnation, aka Pleiadian starseed, Arcturian starseed, etc. As for me, I don't really identify with any specific civilization or ET race, and I've always gotten the intuitive sense that my soul likes to travel, or wander, all throughout the universe impulsively. I once spoke with a psychic in New York who claimed to be able to channel people's spirit guides. Of all the things he told me, the one thing that has always stood out to me was that my guides wished for me to know that my soul is like a cosmic anthropologist in how I approach incarnating on different worlds and the attitude I take towards all living beings and entities alike. I had my doubts about the authenticity of the psychic's abilities, but regardless of whether they were genuinely gifted or not, this message still rings true for me in a deep way. All of these labels can help us to understand ourselves and explain something we had always suspected but couldn't put our fingers on. But they can also be a distraction and confuse us along the way. There are a myriad of ways that we can lose ourselves in the labyrinth of individuality. So, whether you identify as a starseed, a wanderer, a first, second, or third wave volunteer, a crystal child, an indigo child, a rainbow child, a light worker, an earth angel, etc., on some level you are playing the game of the spiritual ego. And I say that not to offend anyone, but because I believe we must all be reminded to keep oneness and connection at the forefront of our consciousness, if our goal is genuinely to be kind and loving beings in service to others. If we truly have a mission, it is surely to facilitate connection, not division. Close encounters of the first kind. After graduating from Pratt Institute, sometime in 2009, with a bachelor's degree in fine arts, I moved to a small nearby apartment to begin figuring out what was next for me and how to navigate life as a young 20-something. The apartment was a 3-story walk-up in Bed-Stuy, where 2 friends and I lived on the top floor. Our rooms were small and the kitchen and living room were all one open space. Not a nice place, but some significant things occurred there. The one redeeming feature of this apartment was our access to the roof, which could only be obtained by climbing up a narrow metal ladder up through a hatch door. The roof was a small secluded space in between 2 taller apartment buildings, with a view of the street on one side and a vast landscape of Brooklyn on the other. I spent many summer nights up there, smoking cigarettes, drinking 40s of cheap beer, and thinking endlessly about existence. Staring off into the distance, hoping for a connection to something deeper and more meaningful than what was seemingly in front of me. I desperately wished for a higher power to reach out and answer the burning questions I had about life. At that time, I thought of a close encounter as something that happened to other people, but not me. As with the nightmares of my early childhood, I was about to experience yet another paradigm shift. My proclivity for ingesting toxic substances was at an all-time high. As a result of these unhealthy habits and my sensitive constitution, I contracted a rather serious case of bronchitis, something that had become an annual occurrence, and rather than allow my body to heal and recuperate, I continued on with my self-destructive habits. This led to some very dangerous symptoms: high fevers, a violent cough, aches and pains, etc. In addition to these physical ailments, I was weighed down by a dark cloud I had carried with me since my early teens. Depression was my invisible friend, and in my college years I dealt with this by self-medicating. For some reason, I didn't make the connection that all of these unhealthy lifestyle choices were contributing significantly to my struggles with mental health. It seemed I was driven by some romantic idea that being in a dark place was somehow glamorous. I was wearing the tortured artist persona a little too tightly. This dark time was also compounded by external factors. After graduating college, I felt free, but also adrift. I knew I needed to become self-sufficient, so I applied to work at the Guitar Center in Brooklyn. It seemed the obvious choice, given that it was 2 train stops away from my apartment, and I loved music. I was hired almost immediately, which was a pleasant surprise to me, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was a lamb who had knocked on a wolf's door, thinking it was fortuitous that he graciously let me inside. Working at Guitar Center at that time was a pathetic attempt to survive in New York City, earning a whopping $7.15 an hour. We worked tirelessly to upsell customers and convince them to buy things that they didn't need in order to increase our potential commission, which I had too much of a conscience to succeed at. It was not a livable wage, but with a little or a lot of financial generosity from my dad, I scraped by. The weight of this soul-sucking job and the abusive way I was treating my body set the scene for a very dark chapter of my life. When the bronchitis hit, I became paranoid that the smoking was damaging my lungs so severely that I was convinced I was coming down with lung cancer or throat cancer or something. Eventually, this caused me such debilitating paranoia and anxiety that it actually drove me to quit. At that time, however, I let the anxiety join the depression as yet another unwelcome character I brought with me everywhere. I'd been anxious before, but this was really the beginning of what was to be a long saga of depression and anxiety playing ping pong with my brain. One afternoon, I woke up on my deflating air mattress feeling helpless and scared, unsure of when the bronchitis would lift. It wasn't just the bronchitis. Whenever something was wrong with me, I would always zoom my perspective out and look at the bigger picture. When I added it all up, it appeared that things had never been so dark for me. I may have even been convinced that I was dying. I basically accepted that this was it. I felt the sudden urge to look for some kind of sonic or binaural healing video on YouTube. I wanted something to listen to as I laid there in misery. I came upon something called Pleiadian healing frequency, or something like that. I played the video, which was essentially just audio over an hour of oscillating tones and ethereal synthesizers, and I laid back down and surrendered to whatever was going to happen. At some point, I began to feel very hot and in need of some fresh air, so I sat up and mentally prepared myself to climb the ladder to the roof. In my sickly state, this was a daunting endeavor. It would have been easier to go downstairs and sit on the stoop in front of the apartment, but for some reason this seemed less appealing. I was certain that what I needed was to go to the roof. I climbed the ladder barefoot. It hurt to stand on the thin and cold metal bars, but I was preoccupied with pressing on. I made my way to the top and opened the hatch, which always felt a little like exiting a small submarine. I closed the hatch and stood on the roof, looking up and breathing in the fresh air and soaking up the sunshine. There was a moment where I just stood there appreciating this feeling. But seconds later, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, about 45 degrees up to my left in the sky. I looked over to see what it was, and to my surprise there was a large, bright, orangish-pink, iridescent-colored sphere floating overhead, slowly gliding towards me on a straight trajectory. It was about the size of a car, and was approximately 20 to 30 feet above my head. It had a luminous quality to it, and although it appeared lighter than air by the way it gracefully crossed the sky, it seemed very dense, like it was made of heavy materials. There were no seams or markings and no indication that it was manufactured in any way that humans are familiar with. Its texture was smooth, but with a sort of matte finish, and it was completely opaque. Its occupants, if there were any, totally concealed. I stared up at the object, bewildered. I knew what it was instinctually, but because I wasn't expecting it, it really caught me off guard. I didn't think too much, though. I knew it would be over soon based on the speed it was traveling, so I remained as present as possible and simply observed it. I remember breaking eye contact with it briefly just to look around and see if anybody else nearby was seeing what I was seeing. I was stupefied by the fact that there was absolutely no one else around in the middle of the afternoon in a busy neighborhood in Brooklyn. It was as if time stood still, and I was in some sort of bubble wherein only this object and I were animated. How could I be the only one seeing this? I thought. As it passed overhead, I felt something coming from it, a subtle feeling that it was trying to communicate something to me. We are here for you. But this was not said with words, but rather a sense of comfort that I got from it. I felt as though this sphere might have been related to the YouTube video, that somehow it had summoned this craft to come and heal me. After all, it was a Pleiadian healing frequency, so they said. As it kept sailing past me, I stared up at it and whispered to myself, "Please help me. I don't want to be here anymore. Come back, please don't leave." I felt as though I was finally speaking to my people, whatever tribe of ETs I hailed from, but there was never any response. It continued to float off into the distance until disappearing completely. I was left feeling hopeful about my life, but also very sad that it was over so quickly. Having had quite a few other encounters like this since then, I've learned that usually the visitation itself is the message, but it's never as revelatory as I'd like. They stop by, say hello, and leave you with more questions than answers. It's always bittersweet. After this event, the belief that I was indeed a starseed was reinforced profoundly. Not only had I finally seen a UFO with my own two eyes, up close and personal, but it had been as though these beings had made a house call on my behalf. This was the first time I felt cared for by these beings that I had only just begun to feel connected to. A few days later, I started feeling much better, and the bronchitis lifted. I felt that this was a direct correlation of my encounter with the sphere, and I resolved to make it count for something, to endeavor to become healthier, and to treat my body with more love and respect, despite the unbearable pain of existing. Return of the Orange Orb. About a year after the first encounter, I had slowly become more comfortable talking about my experience with friends and family members. It was difficult to determine whether or not they believed me, which always left me feeling despondent and alone. Par for the course as far as I was concerned. There was always an air of doubt that was palpable, though unexpressed, as if they were thinking, "You might be making this up to feel special." Others obviously didn't know where to put this information in their worldview, as though I'd just told them I had dinner with Mickey Mouse and was asking to be taken seriously. At least ETs and whatever technology they possess is actually highly plausible, but many of us have been conditioned to put those two kinds of things in the same category. I believe that what I saw was not the actual object, but a projection of my own mind trying to make sense of this quantum topological doorway into dimensions beyond our own. It's as if our dimension is but one among an infinite number of others. David Bowie, musician. One of my closest friends, JC, did believe me. She was super into Coast to Coast AM, and we would often talk about our favorite episodes and share various paranormal experiences that we had each had. In fact, as soon as I told her about my UFO experience, she mentioned that she had recently listened to an episode of the show where people were calling in asking about these orange orbs seen floating across the sky. I had never heard of this before, and I got chills when she told me there were others. It was such a relief to know that I wasn't alone and that this was a real phenomenon, not just UFOs, but this specific kind of object. I expressed how excited I was about this to her, and she promptly copied the episode onto a CDR and mailed it to me. When it finally arrived some weeks later, I listened intently to the whole thing as I sat silent in my room, just feeling relief and basking in this feeling of closure that it gave me. About a year later, after I had moved to a new apartment in Bushwick, about 1.5 miles northeast of Bed-Stuy, I had come down yet again with something serious. It wasn't bronchitis, but it was like the superflu. I was in bed for weeks, and one day in particular, I felt the sudden urge to go up to the roof and get some fresh air. Luckily, this time I didn't have to climb a ladder through a hatch in the ceiling to get there. My new place had a staircase to a door, and a much better view. The second I set foot outside on the roof, I witnessed the same kind of orange orb floating overhead, just above me, like before. This had been about 2 years since the first time. I felt all the same feelings, a longing and a desire for closeness with whomever was piloting this thing. I spoke to it like before. "Do you hear me? Do you see me? Why do you keep visiting me? Please come back." As it sailed off into the distance like some interplanetary ghost, I felt both grateful and sad. Seeing this orange craft again, combined with the synchronicity of having been very ill both times, made me wonder if these beings were checking up on me. Perhaps they had some vested interest in my well-being. I began to relate to them as my people, even though I really have no idea who these crafts belong to. One day, I hope to find out, but it's been over 10 years and I haven't seen one since. Maybe it only happens when I'm in Brooklyn. They can fly to space in seconds, but they can't come to California? Maybe I've been too healthy. Just kidding. Light ships. One night after work, a friend of mine called me up and told me to go check out the harvest moon. She said it was particularly large and beautiful that night, and knew it was something I'd be interested in seeing. I don't think I even knew what a harvest moon was at the time, but I trusted her and decided I'd take a look. After the call, I made my way up to the roof and witnessed something unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I was transfixed by the immensity and spectacular orange hue of the harvest moon, and feeling genuine gratitude and contentment in that moment as I savored the warm summer breeze. Those very brief moments of celestial wonder were quickly interrupted as my attention was abruptly drawn to a bright light that appeared in the sky about 500 feet away. It had a faint orange glow, but it was mostly white. It looked almost indistinguishable from a star, but it looked way too low in the sky to be a star, considering the time of day. The sun was still setting and the stars weren't visible yet. I stared at the object, thinking it was likely an airplane that had just come into view. It was in the same part of the sky where I'd often see planes taking off from LaGuardia Airport. Seconds later, however, 2 more lights appeared on either side of the first light. I began to suspect that these were not planes. The 3 lights were positioned side by side, like Orion's belt. After remaining still for a few moments, the light in the center began circling the light to the left continuously. Its movement was as quick and weightless as an insect, but as steady as a machine. Playful, but masterfully controlled. It did this multiple times before shifting over to circle the light on the right side in the same way. I began to get the feeling that this strange display, this light show in the sky, was being performed for me. It was like watching the stars move around like fireflies. I was utterly enchanted by this as I concluded that these were in fact actual UFOs, or more specifically, orbs or light ships. This wondrous display would abruptly end with all 3 lights coming to a complete stop, frozen in the air, reverting back to their Orion's belt formation, and then seconds later, resuming the same motion. One of the crafts disappeared slowly by fading out like a light on a dimmer switch. Now there were two lights in the sky side by side, completely still. They began to move closer to me as though they were conjoined somehow. They moved as one, in perfect sync. They came towards me several hundred feet in a matter of seconds, paused momentarily, and then moved back to their original position. They repeated this movement several times, perhaps to show me how effortlessly they could travel great distances, as if to say, if you are still doubting whether or not we've traveled here from light years away, let us put that matter to rest. We're the real deal. Once they finished this strange performance, I noticed another object appearing in the distance behind the UFOs. It looked like an airplane leaving LaGuardia. The UFOs seemed to be aware of this almost instantly, and another one of them disappeared like before, leaving only one craft visible. This last craft did something that perplexes me to this day. Instead of disappearing like the others, it began to slowly move across the sky, matching the speed and blinking pattern of the airplane behind it, essentially pretending to be an airplane in order to blend in. After what I'd just witnessed, it was hard to imagine that they would be concerned about being seen. The craft began coming towards me on the same flight path as the airplanes usually would. It never came close enough for me to see any detail. It just looked like a floating light. This really made me feel like I was losing my mind. Why pretend to be an airplane after all that? Were they trying to tell me that sometimes the airplanes in the sky are not always airplanes? I thought, great, now everyone is going to think it was a plane the whole time and I'm just crazy. But honest to God, this is exactly what I saw happen. After the UFO disappeared off into the distance, I sat there in awe. There was an auric residue in the air, an energy radiating off of me, a vapor of excitement and profundity of having just interacted with what I believed to be alien beings. They were aware of me. They were watching me. But why? This was my third UFO encounter in the past 2 years, and I was sitting with the idea that my identification with being a starseed was becoming all too real. It wasn't just an internal feeling anymore, but something that was manifesting in my external experience as well. For me, this was further proof that I was connected to these beings somehow. They were clearly trying to get my attention. I made my way back downstairs to my apartment in a daze. It was similar to that feeling of being in love, where everything around you seems like an unimportant peripheral blur compared to your sudden hyperfixation on the object of your affection. I was so enamored that I didn't even realize until the next day that it was my friend who had told me to go to the roof in the first place. That if it hadn't been for her, I never would have seen what I saw. Did she know? Did she arrange this somehow? I had suspected for a while that she might be a fellow starseed, but she didn't identify as one. Still, I always thought of her that way. Did the beings prompt her to get me on that roof that night? After all, she was the one who called me. I'm certain I must have told her all about it at some point, but I don't remember. She eventually moved somewhere far away and we didn't stay in touch, but I always wished we had. For starseeds, however, I found that it's better not to be too close for too long. We have a way of enabling each other's alienating tendencies. It is believed by some in the starseed community that at least part of our mission, so to speak, is to be evenly spread out all over whatever planet we're on and bring our unique energy to different places and people. We come as a group, but we aren't here to mingle. We're here to work. This work, however, is very lonely, and sometimes it's nice to meet a fellow traveler just to remind ourselves of who we are beyond our human incarnations. Dream contact. In 2013, I had what I tend to think of as my first dream contact experience. I went to sleep the night of January 21st, dwelling on those nightmares of my childhood and asking for answers about it from my spirit guides or whomever had the power to show me the truth. I fell asleep and experienced a typical dream state, till about 3/4 of the way through my sleep cycle, when the quality of the dream suddenly became incredibly lucid. I found myself in a stereotypical American suburban neighborhood, surrounded by middle-class style homes. A black Hummer drove slowly towards me from the distance and stopped about 5 feet away. The driver got out of the car, and we stood in front of what I surmised was his house. I can't remember exactly what his face looked like, but he appeared to be someone from India or South Asia. I noticed immediately that his skin was flickering between brown and blue, as though he was about to change into a blue-skinned man. It was at that moment that he took a pill from his pocket and popped it in his mouth. The flickering stopped, and he looked normal again. He was clearly an otherworldly being who took these pills in order to blend in on Earth, or perhaps he thought that I'd be shocked by his alien appearance and was taking these pills for my benefit. I wish I'd been in a sufficient state of mind to ask him. Once the color change had settled, he began speaking to me without any introduction or greeting. And suddenly I realized there was another person standing behind me. Had they just appeared, or were they there the whole time? I didn't have much time to think about that before the man started launching into his prepared material. He said, "There are 2 books you must read in order to continue on the path to enlightenment: Sulu's Transformation and Sacred Roots." When he said the words Sulu's Transformation, I immediately knew he was referring to the Star Trek character. And when he said the words Sacred Roots, I felt intuitively that his use of the word root was specifically in reference to the roots of medicinal or hallucinogenic plants. After the man gave me his reading list, his daughter came into view a few feet behind him. She climbed inside the Hummer and drove it towards the house that I had previously suspected belonged to the mysterious man. A secret compartment of the house revealed itself as she got close enough to the garage. The entire garage section of the house lifted up very smoothly by some elegant technology, revealing a tunnel which appeared to lead underground. I got a sort of download when I saw this, which communicated with wordless thought that this tunnel went very deep into the planet, to some secret inner Earth society of ETs. The house was just a facade. She then drove the car down into the tunnel, and it closed up behind her. This reiterated for me that the man and his daughter were not normal everyday humans, and that they were likely alien and of higher spiritual and technological development. After this happened, I immediately jarred out of sleep. The names of the 2 books were fresh in my mind. Usually I never remember those kinds of details from dreams, but the 2 book titles were just so unique that I couldn't forget them. When I woke up, I Googled both books, and to my amazement, they actually existed. The first one, which the alien called Sulu's Transformation, was an audiobook called Star Trek Transformations, a Captain Sulu adventure. I read the synopsis, and at first I didn't really see what this book had to do with anything. But after I finished listening to the audiobook, the message was profound and baffling. In the story, Captain Sulu is contacted by an extraterrestrial being in his dreams, just as I had been. So, the ET in my dream told me to read a book I had never heard of, so that I would discover that the book he recommended was about someone who is visited by an alien in their dreams. How very meta. Clearly, he wanted to wow me into taking this experience seriously, and it worked. After I had processed the initial shock of realizing that a dream character had directed me to things that existed in the material world in order to help me on my spiritual path, I couldn't wait to see what the significance of the next book was going to be. The next book, Sacred Roots, which appeared in my search with the exact title, unlike the other book, didn't make nearly as much sense. I distinctly remember feeling in the dream that the word roots specifically referred to plants and not origins or heritage, and yet the only book I could find with the title Sacred Roots had to do with the history of the Christian church. I was turned off by the subject matter and the religious language. Reading it was a total slog, and I couldn't bring myself to finish it. Something inside of me said, no, this isn't it. I guess I was so resistant to organized religion at that point that I never stopped to consider that, although it wasn't my cup of tea, it was a spiritual book of a kind, and therefore somewhat relevant to what he had said. Perhaps there is some connection there that I still have yet to uncover. I still don't know if I could ever muster up the will to read that book. I think I was hoping that maybe it just hadn't been written yet, and I was supposed to find it later on in life at just the right time. Who knows? A day or so later, I was catching up with my mom over the phone, and we were talking about the nightmares I had in my childhood home and the frightening presences that I felt lurking around me all the time. I told her about how I had asked for answers about those experiences just before the dream contact occurred, and that I felt that the dream was some sort of answer to this question. She then told me something I had never heard her say before. During the time that I was having the nightmares, my mom had been telling her friend about my fear of that room and what I was experiencing. Her friend was a psychic of sorts and confirmed that she also felt a dark presence surrounding me and that I shouldn't be sleeping in that room. I never knew that she had warned my mom about that, and that she too felt I was being influenced or manipulated by unseen forces. This was a significant revelation for me because it affirmed that there was something real happening there that wasn't my imagination. After the call, I made some lunch and sat down to watch Frasier, the show I'd been binging at the time. Quite synchronistically, the episode I was watching was one in which Frasier endorses a political candidate running against the one his father supported. Frasier campaigned with him for weeks or however long, and as they got closer to the date of the election, the politician asks Frasier if he can tell him something in confidence. The politician proceeds to tell Frasier that he believes he was abducted by aliens. The aliens tell him that they're unhappy with how we're treating our planet. At this point, Frasier thinks the man is mentally insane and is reluctant to continue endorsing him. At the end of the episode, Frasier asks the man, "Do you actually believe that it happened?" And he replies, "Yes, although I wish it hadn't. It's not really something you believe until it happens to you." I began laughing and crying simultaneously like an insane person. Was I really abducted by aliens? That seemed to be what the universe was trying to tell me in response to my question about the nightmares and this synchronicity that came along with it. Now I was certain that something very real was going on here. Astral Doppelganger. Weeks, or perhaps even months later, I had my first out-of-body experience since the nightmares in my childhood bedroom. During this OBE, I found myself floating around my room rather clumsily. The gravity in this state felt like I was on the moon. I had been attempting astral projection off and on for years with no success. This happened quite by accident. I found the experience fun and fascinating. I discovered that at low velocities I could push against solid matter to propel myself forward, backward, upward, and downward. Not unlike being in a swimming pool. At higher velocities, however, I found that I passed right through solid matter like a ghost. During this OBE, I pushed off of the floor with my feet and floated up to touch the ceiling. But as I came back down, my velocity was such that I ended up passing through the floor, down into the concrete, further down into the dirt and soil, underneath the foundation of the building, and I could see everything as I floated rather helplessly downward into the earth. At some point, I lost consciousness and awoke sometime later in a sleep paralysis state. I couldn't move, but I was fully awake, and I could see a figure approaching me. As he got closer, I realized that he was my exact double, an astral doppelganger. He immediately jumped onto the bed, straddling me, and proceeded to hold me down forcefully by tightly gripping my wrists. It was surreal to see myself in this way, but I didn't have much time to dwell in my fascination due to the aggressive nature of the encounter. I somehow knew intuitively that he was attempting to steal my body, to switch places. He smothered me with his hands and was quite strong, but my belief that this was life or death gave me the strength to break out of the sleep paralysis and wrestle him to the floor. This must have all been out of body, but in the moment it felt completely indistinguishable from waking reality. I could feel my skin on the cold floor and the density of his body as I squeezed him and pushed him away with all of my might. I screamed at him as we fought, "You are not me. I am not you." I kept repeating this to him. Somehow, the words gave me strength. Eventually, I was able to overpower him and get back into the bed, which caused me to wake up almost instantly. When I awoke, I was emotionally, spiritually, and physically exhausted. To this day, I don't know why that happened, who that entity was, or whether or not it will happen again. This was the last significant event that occurred in New York, before I met my wife Vanessa and we moved to California. It would seem that this OBE and the experiences of my childhood and early adulthood had now sufficiently laid the psycho-spiritual groundwork for what would eventually take place during my contact experiences in 2021.